As I said, my name is Mae Brussell, and this program is called World Watchers. This is program number 843, and it is February the 1st, 1988. 11 more months, and we'll be around to Christmas. And if January is any indication of how fast that goes, we better do our shopping. I do want to say before I begin the program that the views expressed here are those of myself and do not necessarily reflect the views of Kazoo's staff or board of directors. This hour of World Watchers is made possible in part by Aries Arts in the heart of Capitola Village, serving Santa Cruz's growing consciousness for over 20 years. I was separating some articles today and came across one that was in my files for a long time and I didn't remember having. That's the fun of going through your old articles and sorting them out. This article was published in 1973, November 17th, 1973, titled An Italian Political Death List. And the point about this list is the people involved were working with our intelligence community. It came from the New York Times and out of Rome. Judicial authorities are examining a death list of 1,617 Italians whom the neo-fascist plotters had allegedly planned to assassinate. The existence of the list is a matter of intense nationwide interest, and membership on it has become a political status symbol. 4 persons, including a lawyer, a doctor, were arrested in northern Italy with a warrant out for the 5th. They are charged with subversive activity with a view to committing a chain of crimes to prepare an ultra-rightist takeover. The investigators are looking into recent robberies to determine whether the alleged conspirators engineered them to raise funds. The list, together with several crates of other evidence, was seized in the villa of the arrested physician, Dr. Porto Casuccia of La Spensa, Genoa, who served as a volunteer with the German Navy during World War II and is said to have many neo-Nazi friends in West Germany. The full list hasn't been published so far, and then it goes on to say that the sources close to the investigation have named 67-year-old Prince Junio Valeria Borghese, now believed to be in Spain, as the mastermind of the conspiracy. Now, on a program that KKUP had this weekend, 14 hours on the Iran-Contra affair, I participated in part of that program, and the question was asked about the Nugan money. Was it important to today's world, and what did I think happened to money amounting to $500 million or $1 billion that has not been claimed, that belonged to the CIA, and William Colby was part of the Nugan Bank, and some very top admirals and generals from our Defense Department. And I said that I believed that this money could go to death squads, that people could be killed, and the importance of this money is that journalists and labor leaders, writers, actors, persons that are not sympathetic to fascism per se, can be wiped out, as there are death squads in this country, I know, and in Italy and all over the world. And Nugan had branches in 16 major cities, but an example of how this money could be used can be related to this particular story that goes back to 1973. This Borghese is the character who was rescued out of Italy by Otto Skorzeny, titled The Most Dangerous Man in Europe, and Skorzeny worked with the Central Intelligence Agency in Madrid, and then they set up the squads, the death squads in Bolivia, in Brazil, and Argentina that were employed by our Contras, used in 1981-82 until they went back to fight the Falklands War for Argentina. These death squads were Paraguay, Uruguay, and so forth. And Borghese worked with those, and with Stefano Della Calle and Otto Skorzeny of the CIA. So a lot of people do not believe that there is a plan, a pre-made plan to have a list. This one was a specific 1,617. So a lot of deaths that are airplane crashes or heart attacks or unanswered questions, untimely deaths of very important people fall into this category. And I know that this clandestine group have worked with James Angleton, who not only is a Knight of Malta, worked with our intelligence in Rome, but carried the Mossad desk for Israel simultaneously with a lot of the Israeli group that are not excluded from this kind of activity. even though their excuse for existence was surviving the concentration camps. I found this very timely because I was talking about these kinds of death lists, and these persons were, in fact, and are working with our intelligence community. As a matter of fact, Borghese was one of the members of the board of Permindex that was identified in the Torbett document and also in Flamon's book, Paris Flamon's book on the Kennedy conspiracy. He's part of the board of directors of the group that set up the front for the murder of John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King, and many others. So if that list was just 1,617 Italians, and you take an American president, a senator that wants to be president, a civil rights leader, how many more people in America belong to the Borghese Permindex group? He was part of the Permindex operation. So it comes close to home, and for people that do not believe in conspiracy theories, I don't think there's many of them around anymore, at least not the ones that listen to Mae Brussell or David Emery, and I think this article is very important. As a matter of fact, on that program on KKUP, David Emery talked. There were many guests. This went on for 14 hours, and John Judge, and the two of them went extensively into the death of witnesses and the importance of people being killed, not only in Central America, as we talk about whether the Contras will be funded or not, but what they're doing in other parts of the world, they're doing to us, and Borghese links directly to our American murders and assassinations and the intelligence community. And I believe the most timely question to be asking is who set up these death squads and how are they acting today and who's funding them today. The San Francisco Chronicle had an article yesterday on the Presidio molestation case that I keep saying I'll update probably next year, slip of the tongue, next week. I'll get into it, but there was a story, 5 counts are taken away from the Presidio molestation case. The United States U.S. Attorney drops 5 charges. There were 60 children molested, and many of them had venereal diseases. That was one of the criteria. Of those, Mr. Hambright was only going to be charged for 10 of the molestations. Now they've dropped it down to 6 children and instead of 12 counts with the 10 children. And the excuse is that these were people too young to really be able to describe the alleged abuse that took place, even though they have venereal disease. So they're whittling this case down with no intention of having Michael Aquino be a part of this case of the U.S. Attorney going into it, even though a 3.5-year-old child described the home, recognized the house, exact house, on a street where she could look up and down at various homes and describe the interior of the house, which was, in fact, as she described it, it is not being touched by the investigation of the Presidio case. The topic of George Bush is in the news constantly, and I think it will be building up. I think the powers that be have decided that he is now expendable. The Republicans are all bouncing on him. What they don't want is the re-election or the election of Bush, and just as Richard Nixon was reelected after the Watergate arrest in 1972, he did win the election, but then he was out with the Watergate investigations that then went into the intelligence community and a lot more, and would be impeachment, but he resigned quickly. And I think the Republicans know, Robert Dole and Pat Robertson and the others, that there are a lot of pieces of evidence that George Bush is very much involved in the Iran part of the Iran-Contra scandal and the Contra part and the arms and breaking the Boland Amendment and working with the people involved in both areas. So the Republicans have decided that he's expendable. And now George Shultz is saying that, yes, Bush was at these meetings, and Caspar Weinberger is saying it, and Edwin Meese, and Donald Reagan. The only one who can't remember is Ronald Reagan, which makes him either very senile and it's time for him to get out of office, or they're all for against him. And after Bush's comments about being at the meeting, the president was asked if he was at the meeting. No, he wasn't. So all of his top aides say he was, and the president said he wasn't. Now, to continue the scandals, the Iran-Contra scandals, the news is filled with the story of Edwin Meese and the oil deal, the Iraq pipeline, and the Bechtel Corporation that George Shultz came from, and Caspar Weinberger, and the payoff that they wanted to give to Shimon Peres to have him not bomb the Iraq pipeline. I had that story on World Watchers November the 2nd, 1987. It's program number 830 if you have the broadcast and the sheets. I talked about the Overseas Private Investment Corporation and the tangled clients. It involved Edwin Meese and went into the details of the Wedtech Corporation and how his attorney E. Robert Wallach already made $1 million profit, attorney's fees on the proposal of the pipeline, and Meese got to invest his $60,000 into it, and then the corporation that the Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of State came from, the Bechtel Corporation, would be building the pipeline. And then to add to that scandal, the story breaks about the offer to Shimon Peres. Will you bomb the pipeline? We'll give you money in your pocket if you don't bomb the pipeline. Now, it's hard to really figure out the team players or the mentality of the people in the news today. It's very confusing for a lot of people because it defies logic. Forget the morality or the ethics of it, using the corporation that Weinberger came from, or Schultz, and using Wedtech, where Mises' lawyer and chief investor are part of that terrible scandal. But Israel is allegedly an enemy of Iraq. That's why they supply arms to Iran. Iraq and Syria are supposed to be their most mortal enemies. So visualize Shimon Peres, who's willing to put money in his own pocket to allow an oil pipeline to go through that would be to the detriment of his own country. And you have to wonder who these people are serving. The team players are so disloyal. It's like Michael Deaver writing about Nancy Reagan and Ronald Reagan. I just wonder where in the world these people are coming from. They're not only sleaze, but they're double sleaze, and there's no loyalty among these thieves. I also mentioned in the same broadcast that that company, Overseas Private Investment Corporation, also gave Costa Rican John Hall, living down there, an American citizen, also a Costa Rican citizen, a $375,000 loan that can't be accounted for. He was getting about $10,000 a month. He was a liaison of the National Security Council to the Contras and of the Central Intelligence to the Contras. And this loan came through Robert Owen, formerly with Robert Keith Gray Associates, and then with Oliver North in the National Security Council. And Hull's collateral wasn't registered, and he absconded evidently with the fees and kept $375,000, and there's no accounting for where in the world that money went. He got $800 a month from the CIA, and so it's the same company, and it not only involves Iraq pipelines, but it involves the John Hull scandal, which is absolutely horrendous. So Meese has made $60,000 investment into a company, and it's the same Shimon Peres that I keep talking about that flew to Cameroon with 17 doctors after the explosion at Cameroon that I believe was the testing of the neutron bomb for the United States. Now, these payoffs to Shimon Peres for that amount of money for the not bombing the Iraq line may have something also to do with Cameroon. These people have a track record of working together on some very shady deals, and this kind of money that's transacted, there has to be other reasons why he would take this money, and it may be payment for silence. There's a sad, long news article in the New York Times. I won't go into many of the details because I really want to update stories on AIDS, but it's titled, "New Surge of AIDS in the Congo May be an Omen for Africa." And I sincerely believe that this disease is set to wipe out all the black population of Africa, if possible. The article describes increasingly the disease is reaching into the middle class, and it also says study traces AIDS in African children. The infection is likely in 1 of 15 if they get transfusions for malarial anemia, if they have malaria or anemia, and get any kind of transfusion. 1 out of 15 of the children is getting AIDS. And that is a visible tragedy, just as Mozambique is, or Ethiopia. And I think we have long overdone the Holocaust in Auschwitz of what happened to the European Jews. If we have sympathy or caring, we're watching millions of people being destroyed right in front of us. And the sound of silence is horrendous, just as it was at the time the Nazis were doing their work. And I certainly hope that some people will care enough to trace the origins of AIDS and the testing of blacks for biochemical warfare in Africa and the Fort Detrick connections, because to me they're so obvious, and I just don't think most people want to admit that we're really into that kind of activity, but I believe we really are. Another article, not an article, a series of articles that's important, and I won't do much on this because it's well covered in all the news stories, is the FBI investigating groups who oppose the Reagan policies. Now, Reagan goes into these various organizations, or as people do, and the Center for Constitutional Rights has gotten, through Freedom of Information, indication of breaking into various offices from 1981 to 85. Well, anybody who spoke Reaganese, and not many people do, I have a very close friend who speaks it with me, we watched Reagan in California through the Army days, the Army surveillance of people, the Isla Vista, the People's Park, the Mind Control Center at UCLA, the SLA, the Manson family that created terrorism up and down this coast, and the files that were kept on the United Farm Workers, on the gay activists, Venceremos, and so forth. And those files were put into a Los Angeles Police Department office where they were ordered by the government to be destroyed in 1975. And then we found out a few years ago, in 1983, January 83, that these files were not destroyed, that they were put into a $100,000 computer and went from the police department to the Office of Western Goals, run by Ollie North's friend Carl Spitz-Channel, and also on the board is John SINGLAUB. Now, SINGLAUB's death squads could eliminate 1,000 domestic people, such as the death list in Italy. He works with Borghese and worked with Otto Skorzeny in the same team. So we're not far away from deciding who lives or dies or has these car crashes or heart attacks or whatever, or strange suicides go flying out of windows. And if you followed Ronald Reagan in California, not everybody had the opportunity to follow him like Californians did, and not every Californian watched him like they should. This is real Reagan operation. This is what he did for 8 years in California. This is what he did, well, during his entire presidency. And keeping these files is just adding to the old files, and it's very dangerous. It's more dangerous now than it was before, because now the soldiers of fortune and the gun-ho survivalists are training to take over, and I don't want to say this lightly, take over this parts of the United States, and they will have their lists of who they want to eliminate. Remember, the Robert Keith Brown worked with Lamar Hunt when they started the AVS group, American Volunteer Group, AVG group, that I've talked about many times, that allegedly was to kill 10,000 political liberals in the United States. That was in Jim Hogan's book, Spooks. Very few people take it seriously. I've had that point on the air year after year, or week after week almost. But Robert Brown was in Grenada with North and with Michael Ledeen and with Admiral Poindexter, and Robert Brown trains the mercenaries that were involved down in Honduras and El Salvador, Nicaragua. And he's the right arm of John SINGLAUB, who started Soldier of Fortune for him. And the people that work with them are in and out of the White House and the National Security Council. So these computers are probably in every major police department. The only reason they were exposed with the Western Goals was because of a lawsuit of various plaintiffs, about 20 or 15 plaintiffs, saying their civil rights were violated and that these files were supposed to be destroyed, and the police department had them. And then when they wanted to trace them, they traced them to the garage of Mary Love, the wife of the man who was taking them, J. Paul, from the police department. And they went to John Reese, the super covert action counterintelligence chairman of Western Goals, and then into the hands of Edward Teller and George Patton III and SINGLAUB and Hans Stenzel of the Luftwaffe and the German offices of Western Goals. They have German offices, and I've done many broadcasts on Western Goals. If you want to obtain those, you can contact me, and I'll tell you which ones they were. This Italian story of wanting to kill 1,617 as a person from Germany, a Nazi from Germany who was part of that plan. And the continuation of those plans is the offices of Western Goals in Germany are a continuation of the same matter. So the FBI story is covered on a lot of the news media, and the going into the offices of people opposing Reagan's policies. This is just one more example of continuing what he was doing out here, and he never has stopped. The head of the Knights of Malta passed away in Italy this past week, and there was just a short notice. Angelo de Mogiano, 82 years old, the head of the Knights of Malta, Sovereign Military Order of Malta. He lived in Milan, a Milan lawyer of noble birth. Many of the Knights of Malta are supposed to be noble birth. He's been the head of it since May 62, and the important thing they mentioned is that there are 10,000 members in 90 countries, 10,000 members of the Sovereign Military Order of Malta, which have literally invaded the intelligence or the military branches of governments to assure the Roman Empire stays secure and on top of all matters. This Grand Master of the Knights of Malta passed away, but in just reading the obituary, you get the figure of how many soldiers they have, the Vatican has, working for them. There was a brief notice that caught my eye just because of the religious people involved. It was a threat made against the PTL President Richard Dorsch, Jessica Hahn's minister, a man of God, Reverend Jean Profeta, demanded in 1984 that Dorsch give Jessica Hahn $265,000 payment, and the interesting threat that the article refers through, triggered the Hahn payment. He said that the minister said he would come to Charlotte, North Carolina, and when he got finished with Jim Baker and Dorsch, we would never be able to do anything else with a woman for the rest of our lives. So you know what part of the anatomy they were going for. One minister is threatening the other manager, president of PTL, that he's going to go after Jim Baker and Dorsch's genitals, I suppose. Very nice language, and this is what they were threatening. Last week, I was mentioning the team that was appointed by Ronald Reagan to take over the plans of the Defense Department for 20 years. And this is so important, I want to mention it and update it again. An article that was in the New York Times called Applying Military Brain to Military Brawn. The assignment of this team, chaired by Dr. Fred Ickley, the head of the New Strategy Commission. And I also mentioned another article, Foreign Policy, run by the Security Elite. This was San Jose Mercury, November the 8th. And a third story, when the commission finished their work, the blueprint of new generation of brilliant conventional weapons. Pentagon will move away from N-arms. And this is about the Commission on Integrated Long-Term Strategy, the blueprint for the 20th century. And I can't repeat this enough, because this week there will be the vote on whether Contras get money or don't get money. But these people have decided and determined that they will either invade Nicaragua or invade Nicaragua. Those are the two choices. So that no matter how many people you tell your congressman to turn down the votes, and it's a worthy cause to say don't vote for Nicaragua funds. These policies are made a long time in advance, and I firmly believe that the only way to stop this kind of activity is to hit the power structure. On this program on KKUP, various people were presenting information, and Daniel Ellsberg was on, and Danny Sheehan, and Martha Honey, and Sarah Nelson, and John Judge, and Barbara Honegger, and a lot of people contributing, Brian Wilson, on the problem of funding Nicaragua and the suit that Danny Sheehan has. But in order to assure that these things don't happen, that they don't happen again, we have to some way find that a man who's elected the president doesn't have to take orders from Kissinger and Brzezinski and Fred Ickley on what is going to happen for the next 20 years. It's already decided what they will do. And one of the things they decided, the blueprint, as I mentioned last week, was to have certain areas where you'd have continuous wars, that they wouldn't be solved, that they would go on continuously, and low-intensity conflicts, and that they would be part of the operation that would be written into the plans. Now, a gentleman whose name I've had on the air many times, Fritz Kramer, I referred to an article a while back, program number 779. It was August 27, 1981, that faceless Fritz Kramer at the Pentagon shares offices with the Undersecretary of the Defense Department, Fred Ickley. Kramer has occupied a post at Undersecretary Fred Ickley's office in the Defense Department in 1981, right at the point that his protégés are preparing to assume emergency rule by decree over the United States. And it's very important, again, to know if Fritz Kramer was the Waffen-SS Fritz Kramer, that was Hitler's right-hand man with Otto Skorzeny, because Skorzeny rescued Borghese, and Borghese has made a lot of policies in the United States and with the intelligence. And Fritz Kramer has his protégés, Henry Kissinger, Alexander Haig, and Zbigniew Brzezinski, and these protégés of his work right with Fred Ickley. And at this time, he was working at the Office for Emergency Planning at the Defense Department. And that went under Mr. Gafrida and Ollie North, and North are protégé of these very people. So Fred Ickley, who made the blueprints for the next 20 years, and then just last week said now he would step down, and Richard Armitage, linked to Theodore Shackley and Kung Sa and the drug traffic, would take his place. Fred Ickley is so important because of the Office Emergency Service that one incident, one agent provocateur incident, just like the Reichstag, and we'd be in the hands of this faceless Fritz Kramer and Fred Ickley, and it may be that's why Ickley stepped down, so he could then work in the emergency service right with and under Fritz Kramer. And Kramer also shares offices with Daniel Graham of Star Wars. In the Washington Post, February of this past year, 1987, there was an article about Fred Ickley, and he warned about people fighting Contra aid. He said, you risk a new Vietnam, and if you turn down, and this is part of his plans, the Defense Department said that if you turn down money for the Contras, then you people who refuse that will force us, like in Vietnam, to go into Nicaragua. The people that don't want Contra aid will be responsible for the invasion. Now, they've already spelled out what it would take, and the invasion of Nicaragua would be the responsibility of those very people who don't want the death squads, who don't want the terror, who want peace in Central America. And Fred Ickley, this article says, an architect of current U.S. policy in Central America, said a cutoff of U.S. aid to the Contras would free Nicaragua to become another Cuba that would be tied to Moscow, and that would require a massive U.S. investment and a large permanent presence of U.S. forces in neighboring countries to keep Nicaragua from exporting insurgency and terrorism. Ickley said the surveillance and manpower would cost $7 billion to $9 billion a year. He thinks the Defense Department should allocate to literally take over Costa Rica and Guatemala and Honduras and El Salvador. Now, if we divided the $9 billion a year between the 5 countries in Central America, everybody would have homes, everybody would have clothes, medical clinics, schools, libraries. Imagine the waste we spend in Vietnam, $1 million an hour. Imagine the waste of saying, if you don't give Contra aid, we're going to allocate $7 to $9 billion a year. It is total insanity, and that's the Ickley, who's the protege and co-partner of Fritz Kramer, and that gives us an excuse to have all these countries in Central America. Hitler said, don't worry about North America. If I have South America, I can take America. And this is literally taking the Fritz Kramer plans with Fred Ickley and then making all of those countries part of a massive America that they literally belong to us. Their economies are militarily related and so forth. And this is very scary, that kind of money that they're willing to put. So one of the alternatives, of course, is to invade Nicaragua. And Parapolitics that came out of Europe, it's printed in France, mentioned the intervention and the plans of the extreme right in an unofficial war in Nicaragua. I'll continue on that in a moment because the subject of Nicaragua is timely. We'll take a 1-minute break first and give you time. I hope you people tape this off the air. One reason I take the break at the half hour is so that you can turn your tape recorder over. I hope you tape it, listen a few times, and then you can erase it if you want, but it's better to understand if you tape it. I also want to announce that tomorrow, February the 2nd at noon, in front of the Monterey Post Office on Hartnell Street, people from the Monterey Peninsula will gather to demonstrate to Ronald Reagan that more than 60% of the American people, support peace efforts in Central America, and say no to Contra aid. We shouldn't say this to Reagan. We should be saying to Fred Ickley and Fritz Kramer and Henry Kissinger. The announcement I received was the demonstration will feature placards, tables with letters and telegrams to sign, leafletting, and speakers who have recently returned from Central America. This action is endorsed by the following organizations: the League of United Latin American Citizens, National Lawyers Guild, Monterey Salinas Chapter, the Latin American Solidarity Committee, the Outreach Committee, the Monterey Peninsula Unitarian Church, the Monterey County Sane Freeze Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, and the Monterey County Sanctuary El Refugio. So if you want to go tomorrow at noon in front of the post office in Monterey and demonstrate your feelings, that would be appropriate and nice. And I do believe that visibility counts, but I also believe that there sometimes should be handbills naming the kinds of people who are behind these operations and smoke them out and ask if the next president is elected, does he take these orders from Fred Ickley and Fritz Kramer? And who are these people anyway? Ickley came from Switzerland, a Swiss banking family. So I always think we have to get a handle on these people and see what they're doing. And just the fact that money goes to Contras has never been enough for me to handle. Now, to continue the second part of World Watchers, this is program 843, and my name is Mae Brussell. In case you pick this up just in the middle of the program and don't know who you're listening to, I want to mention a meeting that took place in the Defense Department in the Pentagon in 1983. And according to accounts, the meeting was for a secret panel assembled by the Reagan administration to direct an unofficial war. And this was before the amendments of the congressional bill that they couldn't have the war. They were planning their own unofficial war. The panel consisted of Edward G. Lansdale, and Lansdale died right after the Iran-Contra story broke, maybe coincidentally, but Mr. Mongoose himself, the man behind covert actions and operations, Lansdale was at the meeting. Edward Luttwak, the author of Coup d'etat, a manual on how to overthrow countries, and it came out just before our country had its coup in Dallas in 1963. Dr. Seal Doss, and he's from the American medical group that was working for the intelligence community in South America and in Vietnam, Southeast Asia. Dr. Sam Sarkisian, Andrew Messing, many of you saw Messing on the TV. He's part of the Soldier of Fortune and the far right-wing group that works with SINGLAUB. Lieutenant Colonel John Wagnerstein, General Harry Aderholt, and Aderholt is part of Gung Ho and Soldier of Fortune and has his own magazine of that ilk. And General John SINGLAUB, also of Western Goals, who serves as the chairman of this organization. This panel first met at the Pentagon under the direction of Undersecretary of Defense Fred Ickley. So there you have Fritz Kramer, the faceless, and I believe the Waffen-SS Fritz Kramer, with Fred Ickley, and the likes of Lansdale and SINGLAUB and Luttwak, and these people have the power to control a coup in the United States as well as any other country. And they were meeting in 1983, and Ickley again links to our plans for the next 20 years, to Fritz Kramer, and to SINGLAUB and that group in the White House. And I think it's important to keep an eye on how they send mercenaries out for various operations. Now, Jack Anderson had a story this Sunday called Special Operations. The United States Armed Forces are geared up for all-out war, but the war they're going to do is called Special Operations Low-Intensity Conflict, and that's what I was referring to last week, that controversial appointment of Mr. BERQUIST, Kenneth BERQUIST, that some people are opposing to be head of low-intensity conflict. And Jack Anderson said the Special Operations Forces were put together in 1986. Congress passed 2 laws, and this is very important to future of the third world, the free world, and even in America. Congress passed 2 laws on special operations and low-intensity conflict. It's SO-LIC. Because of bureaucratic foot-dragging, they may have to have a third bill to do what they should have done already. Congress, our own Congress, imagine, mandated 3 things: the creation of a special assistant to the president on the low-intensity conflict, a new military command post under a 4-star general to cover special operations in all military services, and the new position of Assistant Secretary of Defense for this operation. And what these people are planning for the next 20 years, just as we didn't declare war in Nicaragua, and we haven't declared war in a lot of countries, but we help with the coups. We didn't declare war in Chile or in Haiti, where we put in the right wings, or in Korea. We effectively put in these military dictatorships but don't declare war. And low-intensity counterinsurgents is the kind of operation that is the death squads, the kind that makes Mr. Borghese and the Italian list very minute, considering who these people have offed. And Jack Anderson said the next candidate was from the Justice Department, Kenneth BERQUIST, that's the fellow I talked about last week, whose appointment temporarily is held up. He's a friend of Attorney General Edwin MEESE. So again, we get MEESE making appointments for low-intensity conflict, counterinsurgency, can you imagine? And then the article says BERQUIST had also the support of Frank Carlucci. Well, Carlucci is so closely linked to Edwin Wilson, Frank Churchill, Thomas Klein, Theodore Shackley, defendants of the CHRISTIC Institute, the EATSCO scam, and Michael Ledeen. And Carlucci wants his low-intensity conflict with this particular BERQUIST in there, and Congress had voted for this group. It's really outside the Pentagon. It's a special secret group. Now, there was an article just this past October from the LA Times titled, Philippine Vigilantes Reflect United States Strategy for Low-Intensity Conflict. And this will give you an example of what we're doing in the Philippines. Some weeks after he retired, Army Major John SINGLAUB told the Senate House Iran-Contra committees about his fundraising activities on behalf of Nicaragua. Then he said, I went to the Philippines to research that country's communist insurgency. And you see how much money he sent to the Contras and the damage they've done. My travels went to the southern islands of Negros, Cebu, and Mindanao, and turned up evidence of counterinsurgency strategy advocated by SINGLAUB, this author says, is written by Peter Tart, and other private American citizens of the far right. They've been in Central America. Now they have taken root in the Philippines. The tactics that are used are what the Pentagon strategists call low-intensity conflict, a fight against communism, unconventional warfare, and SINGLAUB's credentials in unconventional warfare are well known. A former chief of the Joint Unconventional Task Force in Vietnam, he participated in Operation Phoenix, the CIA's notorious assassination program that resulted in the murder of 40,000 Viet Cong sympathizers. And there's a nice little tidy death list. Most recently, he served on President Reagan's Special Warfare Advisory Committee. So he's retired, John SINGLAUB, and he's in the Pentagon with Fred Eakley and his secret team, and then he's on the President's Special Warfare, where we don't have to declare war, but we go in and take these countries. There remains much speculation throughout the Philippines on the purpose of his recent visits, spanning a period from July 1986 up to the President 87, and he's the former commander of U.S. forces in South Korea. SINGLAUB was the gentleman who wanted neutron bombs deployed to be used in South Korea against the North Koreans. And this article goes on, special commanders of the armed forces of the Philippines assured this author that these vigilante groups were unarmed, but everywhere I went, I saw M16 automatic rifles, fragmentation grenades, homemade pistols, a variety of machetes, bolo knives, and every turn, men, women, and children wielded these weapons. They were anxious to fight, prepared to die, to defend themselves against communism. We always hear about these martyrs that Khomeini is making, and yet SINGLAUB and the Central Intelligence and the Pentagon are turning these people into Philippine commandos that will die, these young people, and they call themselves the Midnight Attack Commandos. In a downtown street in Davao, they mention these Midnight Commandos, and they go around and boast about dismembering captured communist guerrillas, and that's where SINGLAUB's group are decapitating and putting the heads on sticks and marching through the towns, which is identical to what the Ustashi did in Yugoslavia. And then the heads of the Ustashi were taken, one to South America and Mr. Arturkovich down to Long Beach, Seal Beach in California, where their political activism continued, and they have decapitated people and parade And these people have evangelical religious literature that came from the United States to them, and the literature fills Davao, this area. And this article goes into the fanaticism of the police chief, Mr. Kalita. He's known as the Godfather and the most successful of the counterinsurgency groups where SINGLAUB is going. And their group is called the Alsa Massa, which means masses arise. It was organized by gangs early in 1986, and the movement went nowhere until General Kalita went down to Davao, and then SINGLAUB connected there, and he spent his time there. The Alsa Massa was never a CIA project, but it is a project that is directly linked to the CIA and the Defense Department through the very people working down there. And this article goes into the kinds of vigilantes and the torture and the fanaticism that is going down in the Philippines with the help of the United States Army. And then the article continues that Mr. General Fidel Ramos, who was just promoted by Corazon Aquino, is turning far right. And I read that she also is employing SINGLAUB, and happy to have him there. She's decided to fight the communists. And March 19th, 1987, Richard Armitage, Undersecretary of Defense, Assistant Undersecretary of Defense, was there. And Armitage's name goes throughout this whole article. It's a long article. And, of course, again, he's the gentleman co-partner of Theodore Shackley that Kung Sa says was and probably still is heavy into the drug traffic of Southeast Asia. And there's plenty of it coming up from the Philippines. And this is an article about vigilante justice and how they want to decapitate and hurt, and that the Philippines is a time bomb with weapons coming in from the United States and from the people in the Pentagon, again, working under Fred Ickley, who's co-partner in the offices with Fritz Kramer. Last week I mentioned that a controversial post of the Special Operations Low-Intensity Conflict, and I mentioned Representative Dan Daniel of Virginia, the chairman of the House Armed Services Readiness Subcommittee and House author of the Special Operations legislation. He said he was so upset that he testified it was the first time in 20 years he decided to oppose a White House nomination. This was January the 11th, 1988, in the Washington Post. Well, if you go to January the 24th, 1988, you get the obituary of Dan Daniel, congressman from Virginia, who was taken to a hospital earlier in the day of January the 24th. The officials officially didn't say why he died. He's a member of the House Armed Services Committee, and it was, of course, an apparent heart attack, and he was dead. He was put into the hospital, and he was dead. And the most vocal opposition to the appointment of Mr. BERQUIST, the man that Edwin MEESE and Frank Carlucci wants, is tucked under deep sixth into the grave. And it's very much like to the Congressman Zorinsky. I mentioned that on World Watches a while back. He was exposing the links of Oliver North and Theodore Shackley and Thomas Kleins to the Nugan Bank, and that gets into, again, the $500 million to $1 billion of missing money with the top military. And he was opening up those connections, the Nugan Bank, and just speaking about them. And he was at a public gathering where he collapsed and died of a heart attack. And there went Zorinsky, and the subject of Nugan and Iran-Contra hasn't come up since. Maybe people get a lesson. Maybe he's the only one that wanted to make the connections. But his Armed Services Committee was going into those connections of Iran-Contra. And so Dan Daniels is in the grave. And MEESE and Carlucci can look a little better if they want to push this appointment through. And the death of Zorinsky is another untimely death of a person catching on to the connections of these various people. Now, there was an article in the San Francisco Chronicle which is very serious, which has to do with the Special Operations Low-Intensity Conflict in the United States. And it's the kind of thing which I see, collect, I'm watching it grow like a cancer in this country. I file it under paramilitary and survivalists. I read the Soldier of Fortune. I subscribe to it and get gung-ho when I can. But I want to see who's behind. Robert Brown publishes who's behind all this, pictures of G. Gordon Liddy and SINGLAUB and their ilk. And the point about this story that is terribly important for all of us is what is going on in this country, and it's happening. This is just one example in Marin County The title of the article is Battle Brewing Over War Games in the Woods. And for those of you who get World Watchers in other cities, other states, and even other countries, tell me if you're seeing these articles in your hometowns too, and send me the clippings about them. I would appreciate, many of you do just coordinate what you hear and send me clippings that are going on there. I have articles in Salinas about the Alpha 66 and the anti-Castro Cubans training at Los Padres up in the hills and training their military battles. And this is the story of Marin County that is applicable to what that special operations low-intensity conflict can be in the United States. Marin County Park Ranger Ron Paoli couldn't believe his eyes when he stood on the knoll west of Novato in December and saw an armed man dressed in full battle fatigues creeping through the bush. I saw him before he saw me, Paoli said of the elusive soldier in the mid-30s. When he saw me, he hit the ground and scrambled away on his belly so fast I didn't catch up with him. Paoli is not the only nature enthusiast in Marin County to suddenly find himself staring at an incredibly realistic rifle barrel. The soldier was just one of the growing number of people who've taken out their everyday aggression by playing war games in the woods. Now, I don't believe this is psychological relief, just like blowing gas or some other thing, or anger that now I'm going to take a gun and run around. I think these are paramilitary training for taking over areas of the United States. The Minutemen said they wanted stations every 20 miles across the United States, and that was in the 60s, and they could have achieved it. The Minutemen worked with Lamar Hunt and the AVS group, the American Volunteer Group, the AVG group, and they intended to kill 10,000 liberal Americans, and the training has been going on by these same people, and they're becoming more visible. The article says that platoons, and again, they're practicing their aggression. Platoons toting $70 Uzi submachine guns and stalking the enemy in mock battles do not mix well in Marin County's hiking set. The sight of camouflage warriors with lampak on their faces is so shocking. In fact, some of the people who frequent the county's 7,000 acres of parkland want these games outlawed. And I think all of these survivalist war games and the Franklin campers and these schools for teaching to blow up airplanes and atomic camps should be just closed across the country. The article says they came out of nowhere with lifelike weapons, shooting paint shells at each other so that it's terribly intimidating. Next month, Marin County Supervisor will be asked to ban the GI Joes from the county's only open lands on recommendations of park officials and open space representatives who want to use the land kept for passive purposes. Imagine watching the fatigues, the painted faces, and guerrilla training and knowing that they just as likely will come down from those hills and swoop into the town anytime they want and could have radio controls or listening posts and know exactly what areas they're going to take. The article says we're not talking about a couple of kids playing with cap pistols. These war games are scaring off other visitors. We've had citizens encountering a whole group of 10 people wearing uniforms, wearing helmets, shooting plastic guns. When the hikers come across these guys, they don't stop to ask questions. They turn around and leave. And just believe that every man, woman, and child who has a plastic gun there has a real gun at home if you have this mindset. The article says, although officials do not believe Marin County has any organized club promoting the game, many Marin residents have joined a 70-member Sonoma War Games Club. Members capture enemy flags in 20-man mock battles. The Sonoma Club plays on private lands. Dodging bullets is great exercise, said their organizer, Daniel Garstecki, who works as a computer programmer. I sit around all week and it gets boring. The club has a big battle every Easter Sunday in northern Sonoma County, where 100 foot soldiers play on 700-acre battlefield and shoot one another for ribbons at $5 entry fee. Everybody, according to Sandy Armstrong, owner of G.I. Joe's in Santa Rosa Outlet, knows it's authentic military government-issued stock. And I also have articles on the tanks, war tanks that are being put together, and they have parades around the country where they're assembling war tanks all throughout the country, and they could stop certain major highways and close them off if they wanted to. The article says these people who are upset over the military type of activity, why can't they leave us alone? we're not hurting anybody. It's good, clean fun. Well, we're not hurting anybody yet, any more than the Freikorps did in Germany. It just hurt a few people. But how do we know the future mindset or what they're doing it for if America is dotted with these groups and organizations such as the Aryan Nations up in Idaho, Franklin Camper's Place, G. Gordon Liddy has a training camp like this, and Mitchell Werbel did. His son probably continues it. Multiply the kinds of mentality that are going across the United States and maybe in every state and in the mountains that we're not hearing about in California. Anderson says at this G.I. Joe shop where they have the authentic uniforms of the military that she sells 15,000 tubes of paintballs every 2 weeks, 15,000 balls every 2 weeks, and is constantly reordering the pink and blue marbleized sized pellets used for the war games. The water-soluble paint can be fired with a 50-yard range, and when you hit, you know you're dead. Now just transport that and practice firing on each other and then put a bullet and meet the enemy. You know you're dead, 15,000 of them. The Marin officials agree that even though complaints about war games have increased, there are no reports of injuries. Well, they're not going to kill anybody. They're not going to injure anybody. There's no injuries when you go to a rifle range. There's absolutely no injury with practicing your gun and shooting your Uzi machine gun. The injury comes when you go out in the world to use it against somebody if you don't like somebody. That's when the injury happens. To say there's no injuries now doesn't mean there won't be a lot of deaths later, and that's such a feeble excuse, like letting out my aggressions. The article continues, I'd rather have people carry out aggression that way and have fun doing it rather than going to a playground where somebody could get shot by mistake. Now, those aren't the only alternatives, one to go to a playground and the other to bottle up your aggressions. Maybe there should be more psychiatrists and less war movies and less killing on television and less hatred when people like Pat Robertson say, I think we should kill Gaddafi and killing is all right, and he advocates killing public officials, or we should kill Khomeini, or they have dartboards of Khomeini and public figures, and they plan to kill Salvador Allende or Diem or whoever you want. The choice isn't aggressions or bottling those up and shooting at a school. There must be other choices in this country. And I remember when Mr. Oaks, the American Indian, was shot, and the men that shot him got off, and they said it was open hunting season for Indians. And that quotation has come up several times for killing American Indians. Besides, the article continues, we have 300 square miles where these games might be going on. It's hard enough to enforce the leash law. And the Sonoma County people said that even if Marin takes a stand against the war games, it will never happen in Sonoma County. It will never happen because we have more rednecks here. Now, that tells you where they are. The rednecks are the people in charge of Sonoma County government that wouldn't stop this. So they know who they're dealing with, and the rednecks are buying these T-shirts and sweatshirts, Kill a Commie, and maybe I should bring in Soldier of Fortune next week if you don't get it on the stands and read to you some of the material that they have regarding killing and just one issue, and believe that it's serious, and this is just a microcosm, I know, of the training of these people in California, and it is pertinent because they will be part of the special operations low-intensity conflict when it comes home. If we, in quotes, lose Nicaragua, which we didn't own in the first place, if we lose it, then the war comes home. If we lost Vietnam, then SINGLAUB and his special forces counterinsurgency and Reverend Gale and the whole gang, Richard Butler from Lockheed, he puts on the collar of a churchman and begins training to take America because we're commie Simpson. Congress doesn't know what's good for America. Congress is the enemy, as I mentioned last week in the article on the elite that make the foreign policy. Now, in the few minutes to conclude, I just want to share a quotation from Alex Cockburn, who was speaking at the Julia Morgan Theater. He was at a presentation with Larry Bensky from KPFA December the 4th. And somebody asked him a question, why does the media ignore the CHRISTIC Institute? And Alexander Cockburn said, this is what somebody taped it off there and typed it up for me. This is what he said. CHRISTIC Institute. I think more than anything that gives some of the, if not all of the people named in the CHRISTIC Institute suit. I think there were 29 of them. A hard time is probably a pretty good time, which is Richard Secord and Shackley and the other ones. I have a couple of reservations about it. One, I think there's a tendency, not necessarily in their suit, but in the way the suit's discussed and some of the expressions of it, to read American history in the post-war period or a substantial part of the post-war period as a conspiracy, as something done by a secret team that's run to thwart on an otherwise benign U.S. foreign policy. Now, that somehow reminds me of the people who spent a lot of time preoccupied in the 60s with the assassination theories. He doesn't talk about Mr. Borghese and Perminex. With the Kennedy assassination conspiracy, think about it. The assassination of the Kennedys, and reading a lot of history in terms of ever more Baroque conspiracy. Now, there are a lot of very Baroque conspiracies in recent history, and there's no question of that. But I don't think there's any mystery about who's been running the central conspiracy of the Imperial Project. It's the U.S. government. There's no secret team. It's an open team. Well, I think SINGLAUB and Fred Eakley and Waffen-SS Fritz Kramer, if he is that Waffen-SS, he doesn't come forward, and Sven Kramer are very much the secret team. He says it's the U.S. government. There's no secret team. And I cited earlier the 1983 meetings of these secret teams in the Pentagon and the low intensity, the counterinsurgency and the death squads going on in Philippines, ready to take that over after we clean up in Nicaragua. And he says it's an open team. They're all just sitting there, and you can see who they are. It is the U.S. government, not 29 individuals. I think that's a thing that the CHRISTIC suit sometimes obscures slightly, particularly when people think of the CHRISTIC suit as a political project of their own. I mean, again, I hope the suit succeeds. I think the ends acting on behalf of Honey and Avergan is just fine. But I think to see the political project or the way as it were to go forward from Iran-Contra is a bit of a mistake. I have reservations. I think the suit should go forward, but not to see history as a conspiracy, not to see the suit as the avenue of major political organizing. Well, that is Alex Cockburn, the great liberal who writes for The Nation, formerly a Village Voice, who passes himself off as a liberal, who speaks in the Wall Street Journal and writes for Ladies' Home Journal, not Ladies' Home Journal, but House and Garden. The well-known Alex Cockburn that everybody reveres as the great voice of liberalism, and he will totally ignore these facts of what conspiracy is and the kind of people that I've been mentioning this evening and for many, many weeks in the past and will continue to do in the future. Now, I'm going to continue World Watchers in a few moments with the second part of this program. We're going to take calls. That's your part to contribute to listening and calling in and telling me what's on your mind. And I will conclude by saying the previous hour of World Watchers has been made possible in part by Aries Arts, in the heart of Capitola Village, serving Santa Cruz's growing consciousness for over 20 years. This is Mae Brussell, and I'll be back with you in just a few moments.